Hello. Hey, so I had this whole intro planned out where I was gonna do this whole skit and everything, and I was gonna steal my friend Fuzzy's idea for this video, which I did. But it ended up not actually being very funny, so I deleted it, and this is what you get. Sorry, about that. But yeah, this is basically gonna be a video for Baldur's Gate 3 players who do not play D&D. It's a lore video. It's likely going to be a series of videos explaining a lot of different lore, and I hope you will enjoy it. If throughout this video you're wondering why I keep looking off to the side, it's because this duck has this weapon pointed directly at me. Watch to the end to see if he fires it. This will be the first video in a series of videos I plan to make. I will go over the D&D lore and the important context that is relevant to completely understanding the story of Baldur's Gate 3. Obviously, the game does a pretty good job of filling you in on what you need to know to understand what's going on and be invested in the story, but personally, I enjoy a nice deep dive video every now and then that goes into lore that I'm really interested in, but I don't really know where to start if I were to look it up myself. So I'm gonna hope that my intrusive thoughts are incorrect and that I'm not a strange, weird little creature who has irrelevant interests that no one else experiences. I'm gonna assume that someone else out there will enjoy these videos too. Plus, I like talking about D&D, so it's kind of just fun. But I digress. This video is gonna be about the first choice you have to make in Baldur's Gate 3, which is the race of your character. There are 11 races in Baldur's Gate 3 and like 50 million sub-races. The game does provide you with little blurbs about each race, but you know, there could always be more info, you know, you can't ever have too much. And I wanted to kind of explain to the best of my ability their origins, what they're like, how common they are, and other things about them with the intention of helping people who are interested better understand the potential backgrounds and characteristics of the character they want to make. Now, it's important to remember before we start, Dungeons and Dragons is a collaborative role-playing game, which means that your character is whatever you want it to be. In this video, I'm gonna go over like very generalized descriptions and expectations of the races, but your character can be absolutely anything you want it to be. It can look however you want it to look. It can act however you want it to act. These aren't stone-written rules, and they're not even suggestions. They are very generalized descriptions based on what is written in the Dungeons and Dragons core books. Side note for future reference, the general area I'm talking about is called Faerun. If you hear me say Faerun, that means it's basically the continent that we're on. It's the continent that Baldur's Gate 3 takes place on, and thus the relevant information is going to be from there. And finally, one last thing, sorry, I know, this is a trigger warning. There will be mentions of slavery and xenophobia in this video. You might want to skip this video. I won't hold it against you. I appreciate your interest regardless, and I hope to see you in the next one. Okay, finally, let's get started. First are the elves. We love the elves. Elves in D&D are basically just the classic idea of an elf, Tolkien's version of an elf. They're generally slender, very beautiful creatures who look extremely similar to humans, but they have pointy ears. They can live upwards of 700 years, and somehow they always look flawless with no Botox whatsoever. Elves can be found pretty much everywhere. They have no trouble integrating into society in larger cities, nor do they have trouble surviving on their own or in small groups in the wilderness. I believe most of you watching are humans, and from this moment on, we are all going to consider that you're humans. And so this will be from a human perspective. As a human in Faerun, you would be very likely to have seen, interacted with, befriended, even loved elves in your lifetime. The only stereotype that really exists about elves among the other races are that they can be arrogant and kind of haughty, mostly due to their exceptional skill with magic specifically, but they're also very skilled at a lot of things. And even that stereotype is rarely said with any amount of hatred. It's kind of just like a joke. The dwarves and the elves kind of butt heads at times because the dwarves value hard work and labor a lot, whereas the elves are very carefree and kind of floaty, and they kind of don't care, so they can kind of rub each other the wrong way at times, but there is nothing even close to any kind of feud or disdain or dislike for elves among dwarves, or vice versa. The only people who really have tangible quarrels with elves are other elves. The Drow, or Dark Elves, are the only other race that elves really have a long-standing, eternal feud, and it dates back to the actual creation of the Drow. That stuff doesn't really come up in Baldur's Gate 3, so I'm not going to go over it. I might expand on that in a future video about the pantheons, because it's related to their gods, and I don't want to get into all that in this video, but definitely leave a comment below, though, if you'd like to hear more about that, and I will definitely start working on it. Now, in Baldur's Gate 3, there are 2 available sub-races of elf. There are wood elves and high elves. All elves, but particularly wood elves, tend to have heightened perception and senses. They're very good at detection and at avoiding detection. They're very stealthy and dexterous. They make excellent trackers, scouts, and archers, while high elves tend to be very gifted in the arcane arts. Other than being generally respected and well-liked and immortal and naturally talented and carefree and rich and tall and really ridiculously good looking. There's not much more to say about elves. Tieflings are up next, and they are probably my personal favorite race to play in Dungeons & Dragons. Tieflings are somewhat misunderstood both in and out of the game, but I'm gonna hopefully clear some things up for us all. So many people believe that a tiefling is born when a human has a child with a devil, but this is not the case at all. It's actually a lot more complicated. It's easy to see how people come to this conclusion, though, because tieflings in Baldur's Gate 3 and most other media look kind of like just diet devil. With their red skin, horns, and tails. There is an important reason for this, and I will explain it in just a minute. But first, I want you to erase that image of tieflings from your mind to make this less confusing, and you might want to take notes. Now, before we talk about tieflings, we need to talk about fiends. The word fiend is used to describe a number of evil-aligned creatures from the lower planes. Here are some examples of fiends, but this list is not exhaustive. Their names are not super important. What is important is that through magic, fiends are capable of reproducing with non-fiends, i.e. humans or most other races. Now, the offspring of a human and a fiend is a tiefling. No. What? The half-fiend. I know. Here is a list of creatures that are considered half-fiends. And again, this isn't all of them. Now, when a half-fiend, so human fiend, half-fiend, bears children with a human, that is where baby tieflings come from. What? I know. Well, originally, anyway. Most modern tieflings are just the children of other tieflings. They've become a lot more common these days, so they can just reproduce with each other. Okay, but why the fuck would anyone want to bang a half-fiend? Well, you see, there was once a human empire named Narfell who made some shady pacts with some devils and some fiends for power and for the prosperity of their kingdom, but it ended up, you know, being a bad deal as usual, and they paid dearly for it. But that is basically the origin story of the tiefling. That sounds not real. Look, it's real. Look it up, sis. And get the fuck out of here. I'm trying to make a YouTube video. What? Fuck you. Oh, hey, wait. What? That'll be $25,000. Anyway, so the point is that any half-fiend can make offspring with a human to create a tiefling, and the tiefling offspring usually represent in some way physically their half-fiend sire. So there used to be tieflings of all kinds of colors and shapes and sizes, all based on whatever this half-fiend was. But most tieflings that we've seen look all like red-skinned devil-looking motherfuckers. Why is that? Well, that is because 134 years ago, a group of warlocks worked together with the then archdevil Asmodeus in an attempt to ascend him to godhood. Gods get their powers from their followers, who they create in their image. So these warlocks cooked up a curse that would affect all tieflings that existed at that moment and would realign their lineage to Asmodeus so that he would have a lot of followers. Yo, kind of like people on Instagram. Haha, good joke. And it worked. He ascended to godhood, he became the leader of the 9 hells, and he still is to this day. From then on, all of the tieflings that existed at that time were cursed, as well as their offspring, to be now of Asmodeus's lineage. Other types of tieflings do still exist. They can still be made the old-fashioned way, but it's a lot more rare. But they do exist. Now in Baldur's Gate 3, you have the option of Asmodeus, Mephistopheles, or Zariel. These are the only options we're given in Baldur's Gate 3. They're all devils, but I think it's probably just to make it kind of easier to distinguish the characters from each other. That's how they chose to do it. The only difference between these three sub-races in Baldur's Gate 3 is like the spells you learn and stuff as you level up. Tieflings excel in magical combat because they tend to be very intelligent and they have innate arcane abilities. But Tiefling warriors are not unheard of either. Just kind of less common. Along the Sword Coast, where Baldur's Gate 3 takes place, it isn't uncommon to see Tieflings around, especially in large cities. There are even sometimes Tiefling nobles and tieflings in positions of power, though that is less common. Because tieflings were created through such dark means and because of their unholy appearance, they're generally distrusted and sometimes feared by the other races. Tieflings normally have to go out of their way to earn the trust of the other races and to make friends even among society of people who are not their own. Tieflings are not bound to their ancestors' evil. There are evil tieflings, obviously, but there are also a lot of neutral and good aligned tieflings. But most people, sadly, just refuse to look past the horns. Next is the Drow, which is my second favorite race to play in Dungeons & Dragons. Dristowerden. Anyway, the Drow are actually a subrace of elves, but they would kill you for saying that. Again, it'll be in a different video. I'm not gonna go into their lifelong feud based on their gods' differences. The Drow were basically created to spite the existence of the elves. They tend to live in the Underdark, which the Underdark will probably be its own video. It's basically just like a huge network of cave systems, like continent-sized cave systems underneath the surface of the planet. Drow like it there because they're actually weakened by sunlight. Physically, they're basically identical to elves. They're very dexterous and nimble and perceptive, but they're slightly shorter. And while they are able to learn and use magic, they tend to use it sparingly, preferring crossbow bolts and daggers over spells. The Drow are taught to believe that they are the superior race, not just of elves, but of all races. Because of their severe superiority complex, the Drow tend to live in settlements with only other Drow, and they usually just enslave or kill anyone who comes poking around. Drow society is fueled by their hatred for the other races, especially the elves, and also especially for each other. Violence is almost always the answer with Drow. As you can imagine, these are just some of the reasons why the Drow are widely disliked, even hated, sometimes feared by the rest of the races. So the sub-races for Drow in Baldur's Gate 3 are Lothsworn Drow and Celadrine Drow. Again, has to do with gods, not gonna go over it, but to put it simply, all of the gods in the surface elven pantheon of deities are called the Celadrine. Loth, the goddess who created the Drow, hates the Celadrine and mockingly calls herself and her evil friends the Dark Celadrine, just to further distinguish themselves from the Celadrine. I know, confusing, I'm sorry. But the difference between them, Lothsworn Drow are, as the name suggests, loyal to Loth. They follow her teachings of being a total dickbag to everyone else. Drow who follow the Celadrine are the Drow who reject Loth's teachings, and usually they worship a chaotic good goddess called Elistre, and they are usually good or neutral aligned. As an average Joe in Faerun, it's really rare to see a Drow wandering about. Most people only hear of them, and most who see them don't live to tell the tale. Coming across a good aligned Drow is practically unheard of, but obviously it does happen. But any Drow found on the surface has to do a lot to earn the trust of others, and even if they do, they're still highly distrusted by most people. Speaking of the average Joe, up next is humans. As a human myself, I actually find humans to be the most boring race. I mean, they're actually not. In D&D, humans can be found literally everywhere. Everywhere, across all worlds, all dimensions, all planets, everywhere is humans. Humans have extremely short lifespans compared to the other races, so often disagreements between humans and other races occur simply because their perspective is so limited by the brevity of their life. Life truly is so short. Humans in D&D are highly diverse, with like 100 different variations of humans based on where they're from, just like in real life. In D&D, humans are counted among the ancient races, but no one really knows their origin and no one really cares either. Their existence supposedly predates written history, but it is as of yet unknown and no one seems to care enough to find out, so it'll probably stay that way. There are no legends of creation in D&D, as far as I know, and there's no singular god who claims them. Humans are everywhere. The world is absolutely full of them. The opinions of the other races about humans vary greatly depending on which humans they've met. In general, though, humans are liked or at least tolerated by most other races and are considered pretty harmless as far as the races go. Now the Gith, the most unoriginally named race of the lot. Gith is the name of a lady. Gith is the name of the race. Gith is the name of the language. I'll try to point out which one I am talking about every time I mention it, but buckle up, because it's about to get confusing as hell. Originally, the Gith race was just a collection of humanoid mind flayer slaves. After years and years of enslavement, some of these humanoids began to grow resistant to the psychic abilities of the mind flayers, and some would even train their own psionic powers in secret. Eventually, one of these humanoids, a lady named Gith, led a revolt against the Mind Flayers that resulted in the decimation of their entire empire. The now ex-slaves who followed the lady, Gith, in this revolt started to call themselves Githyanki, which meant children of Gith in their language. And from then on, they were referred to the race called the Githyanki, or the Gith. After they earned their freedom, the Githyanki went about wiping out every fucking mind flayer they could possibly find, burning a massive near-extinction event as mind flayers and elder brains were hunted and killed across the plains. One of the Githyanki, a dude named Zerthamon, he questioned the lady Gith's motives and accused her of wanting to have an empire just as tyrannical and evil as the Mind Flayers had held them in. He was basically like, hey, we're free now. We've killed so many Mind Flayers, they cannot possibly recover from this. Maybe, just a suggestion, maybe we should take a step back from the hunting and killing and focus on ourselves and improve ourselves as a race and unite. Very reasonable suggestion, I think. But apparently, the lady, Gith, and her followers did not agree. However, he did manage to convince enough people to make a small following who separated themselves from Gith. This divide among the people caused a civil war, during which Zerthamon was defeated and killed. And the remaining Githyanki who followed him who didn't die said that they were going to go off and form their own race with blackjack and hookers, and they became known as the Githzerai. So Githyanki and Githzerai are the same race, they're just mad at each other. In Faerun, seeing a Gith, the race, is unheard of. The only reason that a human or anyone would meet a Githyanki in Faerun would be because either you stumbled upon a Githyanki hatchery, or you're about to be murdered and or enslaved by them. Usually both. Either way, few live to tell the tale of sightings, if you can imagine it. Most of the other races have varying unfavorable opinions on the Githyanki, and they normally fear them and or hate them. Moving on, next we have dwarves. Dwarves in D&D are extremely similar to dwarves in Norse mythology and Tolkien's dwarves. D&D dwarves are generally short, stocky people who live underground, usually in mountains. They have a complex, physical, labor-oriented society that exists separately to the other races. They typically consider upholding tradition to be very important to their culture, and they're excellent blacksmiths and craftspeople. They live underground but closer to the surface than the Underdark. Don't worry about it. And they usually live for up to 400 years. In their own society, they normally have a caste system of clans that determines each person's status and privileges. Not all dwarves are this way, though, of course. Many who disagree with the general beliefs of dwarven society will go off and be adventurers or merchants or blacksmiths in the societies and cities of other races, and are generally well respected and accepted. Dwarves often have a strong sense of honor and are considered to be agreeable to most of the other races. Thus, Plus, the dwarven race has very few enemies. Goblins and orcs are the only ones that dwarves will actually go out of their way to kill. Slighting a dwarf tends to be a pretty bad idea. They never forget. Like my ex. Anyway, in Baldur's Gate 3, the dwarven subraces are gold dwarves, shield dwarves, and dwergar. Gold dwarfs and shield dwarfs are physically identical, but they, for some reason, put themselves in categories based on some old xenophobic notions or something like that. Gold dwarfs, also known as hill dwarves, are sort of the smart dwarves who very carefully dabble in magic and tend to be like the CEOs of dwarf companies. While shield dwarfs are more the laboring class of dwarves who, you know, they're blacksmiths, they're workers, they work in the mines, etc. Kind of a questionable categorization. Oh, and they're also known as mountain dwarves. They get the black lung and whatnot. Now the dwergar, or dark dwarves, are pretty drastically different from the other kinds of dwarves. Remember when we talked about how the Drow, the dark elves, they hate the surface elves and they have a long-going feud and blah blah blah? Well, yeah, so pretty much the same thing with dwergar. The dwergar, dark dwarves, hate the other dwarves. They hate each other, always feuding, etc, etc. They not only hate the other dwarves, but they also hate friggin' everybody. They hate everybody. Like everybody. They are naturally lawful evil. Also, remember how the Githyanki were enslaved by mind flayers and then they revolted and became their own race? Well, it's the same thing again. I told you, you might want to take note. The dwergar were once dwarves who were then enslaved by mind flayers and became these dark, underdark dwelling dwarf people. And it became a race of their own who were very much assholes and dicks to everyone, and people hate them a lot. But yeah, then the dwergar revolted and they became their own race, and now they just live in the Underdark and they enslave or kill everyone they come in contact with. A really, really effective way to make friends. So most people, if they do encounter a dwergar, do not live to talk about it. And the only time you would encounter a dwergar is if you're about to be enslaved and or killed, or unspeakable things. Now dwarves themselves are pretty common. They're definitely not as common as humans and elves, but they're pretty common. You get dwarf merchants all over the place and stuff. But dwergar are very rare. You do not see a dwergar and live to talk about it. Next are the half-elves. As we know, Tolkien is credited with our current day depiction of elves in media, but they've existed in human mythology since the 1500s in real life, when mother felt that familiar pain in her wrist when she was kneading dough, or father got a runny nose and had a chesty cough. With no knowledge of carpal tunnel and the common cold, elves were often blamed for these minor or sometimes major annoyances. Tales of these supernatural magical beings who spoiled crops and stole babies were really common for hundreds of years. And despite them not existing, the stories about elves were so persistent and subversive that they affected real life laws and society, so in a way they kind of were real. But regardless of their realness, there is one important question that has plagued humans since the very first elf story was created.
Can you fuck it?
Well, it turns out in D&D you can, and that's how you get a half-elf. Half-elf is really only used to describe a cross between an elf and a human, but other types of half-elves can exist. I don't know what kinds, it doesn't really specify, but they can exist apparently. Whether or not half-elves can reproduce is usually up to your dungeon master when it is relevant, which is probably not often. Half-elves are pretty common in Faerun. You'll see them around, but they're not common enough to actually have their own society, so they really don't have any homeland or any place where, like, there are no half-elf only communities, really. They're common in large cities where they can be surrounded by diversity. Since they don't claim fully human culture nor fully elven culture, they can sometimes have a rough life, finding it difficult to find acceptance among elves or humans. Usually not finding acceptance fully in either. There aren't enough half-elves to join together to make their own society or anything, so they tend to be wanderers, adventurers, or having some other eccentric job that allows them to travel a lot, perhaps always searching for a place where they feel like they belong. The half-elf subraces in Baldur's Gate 3 focus on the elf side of the equation. The subraces of half-elf are High Half-elf, Wood Half-elf, and Half-drow. There isn't much to say about it because it's exactly the same as the elves, as the High elves, Wood elves, exactly the same characteristics and stuff, it's just with a little human tossed in there. Half-drow, however, tend to be persecuted as severely as a full drow would be, regardless of their own beliefs, and a lot of half-drow are not evil aligned. Like, it is far more common to find a good aligned or neutral aligned half-drow than it is to find a full drow of the same alignment. But regardless, they are forced to really work hard to earn the trust of others, and thus they can usually be found doing mercenary work or other jobs where they command respect with their abilities and their skills, as opposed to having assumed respect. Half-elves can find themselves to be multi-talented, honing the skills that they inherited from their ancestors, or they might find themselves unable to specialize in anything, feeling no particular calling in life. Either way, they're a versatile race with a lot of potential for dramatic backstories and growth, so they're really fun to play. Halflings! Halflings are based on Tolkien's Hobbit. They're one of the OG races in Dungeons & Dragons. They're typically a couple of feet shorter than humans, though they're built exactly the same, and they live roughly 150 years. They tend to be very happy people who are known for being brave, curious, and lucky. They're dexterous creatures who make excellent archers, scouts, rogues, and especially bards, though they can get away with being any class, really. One drawback, though, is that they actually can't use some larger weapons because of their small size. So yeah, they tend to be swift little musical ninjas. Halflings are relatively common around Faerun, probably more common than half-elves, about as common or slightly less common than dwarves, and much less common than elves and humans, but they're the most common, so you know. Seeing halflings in large cities is commonplace. There are enough halflings to make up small communities distributed sporadically around Faerun, but they tend to be wanderers. In halfling society, they treasure storytelling and folklore, and they often keep track of history through songs and bedtime stories, hence why they make great bards. They're also able to fit in pretty much anywhere because of their friendly, outgoing nature. They're generally respected by the other races and well liked. The sub-races in Baldur's Gate 3 are Lightfoot and Strongheart. Lightfoot halflings are the most common halfling in existence. They tend to favor endlessly traveling from place to place to sate their wanderlust, and they are the more dexterous of the two varieties, while Strongheart halflings are kind of the stockier, stronger, beefier, armor-wearing type. They live in small communities that travel around together. They also tend to be more talented in magic than the Lightfoot halflings, but all halflings are capable of magic. Short and sweet, just like halflings, there's not much more to say about them. Speaking of short, gnomes! Gnomes are highly intelligent little nerds who tend to dislike attention and prefer a simple, honest life. They tend to be very creative, clever, and technically skilled, hence why the stereotype of the gnome tinkerer exists. They live for about 300 years and they make excellent wizards, warlocks, bards, sorcerers. They also, adorably, love gemstones. Gems of all kinds, not out of greed though, just out of sheer appreciation for their beauty and power. They, like dwarves, can often be found in mines, but where dwarves harvest or gnomes harvest gemstones. Some gnomes have an insatiable hunger for knowledge and will go to great length to uncover the answer to some mystery, though most tend to be much milder while still naturally curious. As a human, it would be a rare occasion to see a gnome, unless you're in a huge city like Baldur's Gate or Waterdeep. Even in cities, you're likely only to see a couple of gnome shopkeepers if you're lucky. They tend to live in small, well-hidden communities that are concealed by magic, so it is really difficult to find for anyone unwelcome. In Baldur's Gate 3, the available sub-races are rock gnomes, forest gnomes, and deep gnomes. Rock gnomes are the most common. They tend to be happy, playful, even childlike, regardless of their age. They love to play pranks on people and annoy them, and they live life to the fullest. Forest gnomes are the least common, and they are severely averse to any kind of society. They go out of their way and make sure they are hidden at all costs. They're so uncommon, in fact, that they're existence is regularly forgotten about and has to be rediscovered by the other races on a regular basis. And finally, deep gnomes are the gnomes native to the Underdark, and as I'm sure you can guess, they're evil. No, they're not, but they're very suspicious and distrusting of other races. They're also very rare to see. It is very uncommon to see a deep gnome but they avoid the other races out of suspicion and out of distrust, as opposed to the fear that the forest gnomes have toward other societies. Deep gnomes have adapted and evolved in the Underdark, and therefore they never let their guard down in order to ensure their survival. Gnomes are funny little things, but you gotta love their ingenuity. Next are Dragonborn. Don't worry, we're nearly done. If you're still awake, go down in the comments and type, "Yay, Dragonborn!" Anyway, Dragonborn is the fitting name for this race of people in Dungeons & Dragons who either descended from or were created by dragons, and it's not just some asshole who runs around shouting at people. The whole story of how Dragonborn came to be in Faerûn would take ages to explain, and a lot of it's not that important. All you really need to know is that Dragonborn have always been considered very alien and culturally strange to the other races on Faerûn. Basically, dragons used to live in a society.
We live in a society
With politics, an economy, a hierarchy, all that good shit. But then the two dragon gods of good and evil, Bahamut and Tiamat, respectively, decided to start a civil war, and they fucked everything up and screwed everyone over, and it just ruined all of their good things. It's why they can't have nice things. During the time where they were in a society, however, the dragons were entreated by their god Io to little small servants, slaves, who resembled them. Exactly how and why the Dragonborn came to exist is up for debate. Some people believe that they were created specifically to serve as slaves for dragons, while others believed that they were created as some kind of divine science experiment to discover what the most perfect race would be. Kind of very contrasting stories, but no one really knows. Either way, the Dragonborn rose up from their slavery positions and revolted, and it was successful, and they won the day because the dragons were too distracted by their stupid civil war to really say anything about it. And so they became their own race, and then Palpatine has returned, magically arrived in Faerûn, where they live to this day. Now, you might have noticed there's like a fucking 100 different sub-races of Dragonborn. Let me contextualize that. Basically, there are these aforementioned dragon gods called Bahamut and Tiamat. Bahamut is the good guy dragon who rules the metallic dragons. Gold, silver, bronze, they are good aligned. The evil dragons are ruled by Tiamat, and they are the chromatic dragons. Green, red, blue, etc. They're evil. That's what they are. Each color of dragon is associated with different abilities, and the Dragonborn, whose ancestry comes from that color of dragon, inherits some of that dragon's abilities that are specific to its color. I don't think they have to necessarily inherit their alignment. Like, I think that blue Dragonborn don't inherently have to be evil, but I'm actually not 100% sure on that. I would think not, though. There are also gem-colored dragons, but they're not included in the sub-races in Baldur's Gate 3, so I'm not going to bother with it. In Faerûn, there's a pretty large settlement of Dragonborn where most of them reside. Dragonborn tend to be very pragmatic and logical, which permeates all aspects of their culture, from marriage to war. They also have a strong sense of honor, and they strive to be a society free of war, which leaves them with very few enemies among the other races. They have a strong hatred for dragons, never forgetting their past, but they are generally well respected by the other races. Those outside of Dragonborn society have no hatred for the Dragonborn, though many people find their cultural differences to be hard to understand. While it isn't unheard of for Dragonborn to visit or even live in larger human settlements or other settlements of other races, they are still a pretty rare sight. Finally, praise Jesus. The Half-orcs. Half-orcs. The name is kind of self-explanatory. They are, once again, a human mixed with an orc. First, though, let's briefly talk about orcs. It won't take long, I promise. Over the years, orcs have been depicted in all kinds of media, and usually they are depicted as the antagonists. Their sole purpose is to kill and destroy, and honestly, D&D orcs pretty much follow the same narrative. In D&D, orcs are widely feared or hated, or both. They have centuries-old feuds with elves and dwarves and everyone because they suck so much. They have very few allies, not that they really need them. Orcs don't really have a homeland. They can be found everywhere, and they tend to make their settlements after conquering and then fortifying the settlement of someone else, so taking it from someone else, basically. Hence their bad reputation. There was once, however, an orcish settlement called the Kingdom of Many Arrows. It was, to quote the wiki, remarkably civilized. Many Arrows existed in relative peace with the other races for quite some time, and it was during this time that many half-orcs were born. From there, half-orcs just took off and they were able to reproduce with each other, and that's how the half-orc race exists. I don't know if this was the official birth of the half-orc race, but it definitely increased their numbers significantly. The Kingdom of Many Arrows was eventually, unfortunately, destroyed, and many of the orcs returned to their old marauding ways to terrorize the landscape once again. This left a whole new race of half-orcs with having identity crises all over Faerun. They didn't belong anywhere. They were distrusted and sometimes hated for no reason because of their orcness, and hated by orcs because of their humanness. So they, like half-elves, really didn't have a homeland nor anywhere that they actually belonged. They were far more distrusted than half-elves. Half-elves had an easier time than half-orcs. Being a half-orc is a tough life. Now, each half-orc deals with this outcasting of their kind differently. Some might go out of their way to really earn and strive to be a good half-orc and earn the trust of the other races, usually making a name for themselves as an exception to the rule, as opposed to just being an example of a good half-orc, unfortunately. But then again, some half-orcs will just say there's no point, and they will give in to the evil that other people claim them to be, and they will become that evil. Half-orcs tend to be pretty martially talented. They take up a lot of mercenary work or other jobs that require muscle. It's not unheard of for them to practice magic, but it's much less common. Their lifespan is typically the same as a human, and love them or hate them, they're pretty versatile and have a lot to offer as a character. And that is all of the races we have available in Baldur's Gate 3 as of right now. If any more come out at some point, I'll probably make them their own shorter video in the future. Thank you so much for watching to the end. If you're still here, let me know in the comments what the race of your Baldur's Gate 3 character is, and what are they like. My current character is a Celadrine Drow Paladin Warlock multi-class. If you were gonna play D&D, what type of character would you make? Let me know, I'd love to hear it. If you're interested in more Baldur's Gate 3 lore explained for people who are unfamiliar with D&D, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next video that comes out. I'm not sure what it'll be yet, I'm working on it, but I will try to get them out in a reasonable amount of time. I intend to go over all of the aspects of the story that kind of could do with a little more explaining, or just things that I find interesting, or things that you guys suggest if you like. If you have any suggestions, let me know. I would love that. I hope to see you in the next one, and may the dice be forever in your favor.